Hi, my name's Howard Lyon. Thanks for joining me for my video, Brigid the Exalted One. This is a painting of a Celtic character who represents spring. She's kind of the parallel in Greek mythology of Persephone. And I wanted to do some different mythology, not just the Greek mythology. I'm going to talk today about the composition and the decisions that I made and the reference that I used, as well as the painting process. So here's my digital comp, and you can kind of see that transition. I put this together in Photoshop and Procreate on my iPad. And here is the original photo reference that I started from. I think it's important for you to see the reference that I used so that you can see where I took it. On the left is the reference, on the right is my final comp, and you can see some of the changes that I made, the lighting that I added, the changes to her expression, her eyebrows, the angle of the eyes, adding the necklace in, enhancing kind of the flow of the robe down on her arms. I cleaned up some of the fabric in places, like on her arm, to give it a more dramatic and definitive direction. And changed a little bit of the bodice where it was a little bit odd. And I also, these red lines kind of represent the thrust or the gesture that I wanted to create with it. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other lines going on, but whenever the opportunity came up, I tried to enhance this flow, like the little push of hair, changing the flow of the robe, the petals that I added down there kind of flow in that direction. And it doesn't move the viewer's eye around, but it gives it an organization. It gives the painting an organization. And then I wanted to make sure that I accentuated her face. And so I literally framed her head within the piece with this circle of vines or branches around her head. Kind of as a counter to those lines. So here's kind of the general mindset that I had. So as I made decisions in the painting, if there was a question as to which way I wanted some lines to go or flow or to push things, these directions helped me make that decision. And I think it's important in your compositions to have a thrust or two, a direction that you're going to push lines and give your painting a structure or an organization. So here we are with the drawing put onto a piece of linen that has been mounted onto a piece of 1/2-inch gator board. And gator board is just wood laminated over a foam core. And it's a nice substrate. I don't use it as much anymore. I made a bunch of panels to use. I don't use it as much anymore because if you drop it, those corners are pretty fragile and they can break. But it's wonderfully light, and it's a very nice flat surface to work on. So it's too bad that it's as fragile as it is. I've seen some artists, when they put linen or canvas on it, they will wrap it around the edge of it to protect it a little bit more. But I've since started using a product called Alumilite, which is aluminum over a polyethylene corrugated core. And it's quite light as well. Not as light as the gator board, but very light and withstands some abuse a little bit more. If you drop it, the corner might bend, but you can bend it back. So this is my color block in. And if you've watched my videos before, you know that at this stage, I'm really not aiming for a beautiful painting. What I am aiming for is a fairly accurate wash in, almost watercolory, of the colors and values that will be in the final painting. And this is just a mix of straight oil paint with some Gamsol in it to thin it out a little bit. And that does the trick. It keeps it fairly thin and washy. And one of the advantages is that it goes down quickly. And another is that it dries fairly quick because the paint is quite thin. and the Gamsol also evaporates faster than the linseed oil does, and so it tends to be plenty dry by the next day to work over it, sometimes even the same day, depending on what colors I've used. Now, as I go into an area, I'm looking for the dark shapes and painting those in first, and then I will hit the lighter shapes. And one of the difficult questions, one of the difficult things to learn is, how do you know what goes into the dark side and what goes into the light? Sometimes it's very obvious, but other times when the lighting is a little more subtle, it can be harder to tell. But that's just one of the decisions that you need to make. But the important thing is to make it. It's okay if you overemphasize the dark or even overemphasize the light, as long as you're consistent in the decisions that you make. And so when you go into an area like on that blouse, I'd make a decision, this is the dark side and this is the light side. And where the reason that is important is because as you're making decisions for reflected lights and midtones and highlights, you want to cleanly separate them. And the light in the dark side doesn't ever get brighter than the lightest areas in the light side, and that helps to keep the forms intact and help them turn. I was filming this video on location instead of being in my studio. I've traveled down to Arizona this month and painted it here, and I'm in my cousin's condo, and so there's the staircase in the background instead of my usual wall easel. So you might see some people. I think I saw my son's legs in the background before, so you might see some people stand in here and there, but that's what that's about. When you're mixing up flesh, it's easy for flesh to get a little too muddy, a little too sometimes muddy or chalky, and one of the keys to preventing that is to keep your shadows clean and intense. I think everyone who's taken some oil painting classes might have heard people say never use ivory black when you're mixing skin, and I don't agree with that. Ivory black is a great color to mix up a neutral and to help neutralize other colors, but you don't want to just darken your shadows by adding ivory black. You can neutralize your shadows with ivory black, but what that means in practical terms is when you're looking at your shadows and you're trying to mix that value, use colors, use pigments that will let you mix that dark value first, and then if it's too intense, you can mix a gray into it in order to neutralize it. You can also mix in a complementary color to help with that, but I find that it's easier to mix a gray and add it to a color in order to make it less saturated or less chromatic than it is to mix in a complement. So to me, that's the easier route to take, and it has a very nice result. So you can see I blocked in the darks, and then I've gone in and I'm put the lights in, and now I am refining the form just a little bit in my underpainting. But you can see that the underpainting isn't beautiful by any stretch. It's got a long ways to go towards the finish. But this gives me a very solid foundation to build on. And I've kept the colors quite clean, and that will also help too. The little bits of those colors will show through as I'm working on the subsequent layers. Some good mixtures for flesh tones that I like. I like flake white a lot when I'm mixing colors, though titanium white is great too. One of the reasons I like flake white is because it's not as powerful as a white as titanium. It's semi-transparent or semi-opaque, depending on which way you want to look at it. And when you add it to other colors, it doesn't affect those colors as quickly as titanium white does. When you add titanium white, you can very easily overpower the color and end up with a washed out mixture, and then you have to add more color in and more color in to get it back to where you wanted it to be. whereas flake white is a lot more forgiving. Now, flake is, of course, made from lead. If you were a very messy painter and you like to eat when you're painting, you might not want to use flake white. But if you are a clean painter and you don't mind washing your hands when you get up from painting, then flake white's going to be just fine. If you have little kids that might get into your paints, then you may have some other challenges too there. That is always a concern. Then you could be mindful of flake and cobalt and cadmiums and vermilions and Naples yellow and all of those paints. You always want to be careful. You wouldn't want anyone to get hurt because of the materials that you're using. But taking all of that into consideration, flake is an absolutely wonderful pigment to paint if you feel like you can use it safely and as an adult, as long as you're not ingesting it. Everything that I've read, you'll be just fine. Consider giving it a try if you are interested in seeing what flake white is all about. It also dries to a more flexible film than titanium. Titanium is a little more brittle when it dries. And so paintings tend to last longer when they use flake. And flake also dries a little bit quicker, and it also dries differently. As lead helps to cure the paint from the inside out and not just oxidize from the outside in, like some other pigments or like linseed. So that's also a bonus that you get with flake white, is better drying properties and a better paint film when it's all said and done. I am using flake in this pass, and I've also found that cadmium pigments mix with a little bit more intensity as they get higher in value than they do with the titanium. And it was explained to me, I don't have research to back this up, but it was explained to me that because of the larger pigment particle sizes in the flake white, you maintain a little more intensity in those mixtures as they get higher in value. Whereas titanium is a very fine, small particle size, and so it tends to obscure the pigments that it's mixed with just a little bit more. That's, of course, part of the reason that it is so opaque, but it's also why colors can look a little bit chalky sometimes when they're mixed with titanium, or a little bit more so than when mixed with flake white. So anyways, a little bit of an aside there on titanium and flake, but that's why I like flake better than titanium in a lot of cases. Now, I always keep titanium with me. I will use it when I'm doing alla prima painting. I'll use it often when I'm doing landscape outdoors, so plein air work. And I'll also use it if I need a very opaque white going down. Sometimes when I'm doing something that needs to glow or really pop, I will use titanium white for its opacity. So it is a consistent and valuable part of my palette, but I love the qualities of flake, especially when it comes to painting flesh. So the mixtures that I'm using here for flesh, I started to explain that and got sidetracked. The mixtures that I'm using here for flesh, I'm using some yellow ochre and some Naples yellow and some Terra Rosa from Vasari. It's a beautifully intense version of Terra Rosa. I'm sure there's other brands that have just as nice of a color, but that's the one that I have on my palette. And I'm also using cadmium red light. And those are the colors that I'm using to get my oranges. And then I will mix an ivory black with the flake white to mix up a gray to neutralize a color. Or sometimes I'll use Bice from Vasari. Bice is a custom or proprietary mixture that they have that is kind of a medium strength, warm, middle value blue. It's an interesting color. I wouldn't have guessed it would be so useful, but it's quite beautiful for neutralizing colors. You can see over her eyelid where that color is a little bit cooler. I've mixed a little bit of the Bice into that in order to neutralize it. You can mix it yourself, I'm sure. If you used probably ultramarine blue or cobalt blue with a little bit of yellow ochre or maybe raw sienna and titanium white, you'd probably end up with something similar to Bice. If you want to give that a try, you can go look it up on their website to get an idea of what that color looks like, but it's very valuable. I know some people will use, like Jeremy Lipking will use a mixture of ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson to make a beautiful violet color to neutralize some of the flesh tones. And that's quite wonderful if you look at his work, especially some of his earlier work that can be very prominent in it where you see that violet in the flesh tones. King's blue is another color that can be beautiful for mixing into flesh if you want to cool that transition into the shadows. Now, once I do that, I often keep the shadows a little bit hotter. I use that cooler mixture in the flesh where I want to turn the flesh, turn that form, and I will also use it where I want just the flesh to be a little bit more neutral, like it is down on her neck and even into her chest. So you'll also see that around her chin and mouth where those tones tend to get a little bit cooler. I'm using a beautiful little size 0 round from the Eclipse line from Rosemary & Co. brushes right now. And it's a wonderful little detail brush. I've talked about it before. It's a round, so you can get a very nice point with it, but you can also kind of mush it flat on the palette, draw it. So instead of a round, you get a nice low flat point with it. So that can be very useful too. The brush that I'm using there is an older brush that I had that is a Winsor Newton Monarch brush. I've replaced most of them in my palette now. That's a size 4 Winsor Newton Monarch, and it's a synthetic mongoose. And I've replaced most of them now with the Eclipse line from Rosemary because it's about 1/4 of the cost, unless you get it on sale, and then it's probably still twice as expensive. The Winsor Newton Monarch is probably twice as expensive as the Rosemary equivalent. The room that I'm in, the lighting conditions change throughout the day. I've got a big north light window, whereas in my home studio, my lighting is a little more controlled with the artificial lights. I do have artificial light on this, but I also have the north light that's providing about half the light. So you'll see as the day goes by, you'll see the lighting change. So I apologize for that, but I don't think it gets in the way of showing this process. I'm going back in and refining the shape of those dark areas. Sometimes when you lose a likeness in an area, so when you're struggling, when you say this just doesn't look right, the place that you want to refer to first are the shadow shapes. And if you can get those shadow shapes right, you're going to get the likeness of whatever it is that you're painting. When I'm painting in and around the eyes, especially where the eyelid meets the fatty fold above it of the eye socket, and also the underside of the eye, I will often use that Terra Rosa color mixed with a little bit of quinacridone magenta or a permanent madder deep to get those beautiful deep reds, at the corner of the eye or in that fold above the eye. And you can get very intense colors there. And one of the beautiful things that you can do in painting flesh is to keep most of the colors quite gray and quite neutral, except for in the shadows and in the areas where flesh gets close to flesh, like in the lips and the nostrils, the ears, and around the eyes. And there you can really punch the color up. You can also do that on the light facing side where the hair meets the head, because often light will hit the scalp or hit the skin right by the hairline and bounce in and back and forth between the skin and the hair and really illuminate it and create a very saturated transition. That little part on the cheek where it transitions into the brow and temple is always tricky. It's very easy to overdo that, either make it too bright or too dark and miss that transition. But you want to keep in mind the form of the head, the form of the skull, and that anything that isn't the light facing plane, as it turns away from the source of the light, is going to get darker. And so as you're comparing values and trying to make those relative judgments, it's good to keep that in mind. Knowing the anatomy of what you're painting will often help inform you when what you are painting is confusing or challenging because of the way it's lit. So studying that anatomy, and I think it helps to visualize yourself on the surface of whatever it is that you're painting to help view where the light is coming from. You can imagine yourself as like a little ant on the surface of the face of whoever it is you're painting, and you're crawling around, and you can look up and see where the sun is or see where the light is. And are you in the shadow? Are you in the light? Are you in the hottest, lightest part? Or are you on the transition? On the side of the face that is turning away where it meets that hair, I wanted to really make sure that red is soft. And so that edge is very, there's a blended transition between that edge on the left side of the face and the hair. And that helps to convey that sense of softness. Again, if you've watched my videos before, you've probably heard me say it, that all edges should be soft unless you can justify them being hard. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to be all fuzzy and blurry, but save those very crisp, sharp edges for the places where you want the most focus. And if something is soft, then make its edges soft. That's just a general rule. It can absolutely be broken. But when you're trying to decide how to manipulate the edges of your form, keep that in mind. And I think, that usually doesn't let me down. And then if there are areas where I want to break that, to change emphasis and draw the eye, because contrast draws eye, and contrast of edge is a very strong form of contrast, then I will break those rules at that time. But until then, I'm going to assume that all of the edges are generally soft. When you're painting the eyes, sometimes it can be tricky to get both of the eye shapes the same and make sure that the eyes look like they're looking the same direction. Right now, my eye shapes are just a little bit off, and I'll catch that later and be able to make those adjustments. But um, the irises, that shape, when someone is gazing at something, they aren't always going to be the exact same size and width, depending upon the angle that you're looking at them. If they're straight on, then they're going to be pretty darn close. But if their head is turned, then the eye that is further away is going to be turned a little bit further in the socket, and the shape of the iris is going to be a little more oblated than the other one. So keep that in mind as you're painting people, that to really pay attention to the shapes that you're seeing and not the conception that you might have in your mind as to what an eye looks like, and that will help you. The dark shape of the iris, getting that position correctly within the white space of the eye, so the sclera, the white part, is critical towards getting the measurements correctly and being able to paint that correctly. So if you're off, really compare the amount of white on the left and right side of the eye in relation to the iris, and that usually will help you get an accurate measurement there. Because it's easy to spot and see, oh, I've got too much white of the eye exposed on the right side compared to the left side of the iris. So a lot of what I'm doing now, I have the colors fairly well established, is making small refinements to the form, making small refinements to the values that are there, and then refining the form. So you could see, like on that forehead on the left side, I needed to push the values down a little bit darker in order to turn that form. And you'll also notice that the chroma, the intensity of the chroma on the left-hand side of the forehead and the hair on the left-hand side is much more intense than the chroma on the right-hand side. That is because that is on the light-facing side. Now, I'm not counting the very bright rim light that's coming from behind and to the right. And that will kind of be its own beast as I render it. I am talking about what would be the sun in this scene, or a primary light in this scene versus this light coming in. So in a natural setting, I could imagine the primary light being a skylight and the light hitting her from behind, maybe coming in through a window. Of course, when I took this reference, it was one flash behind her and one flash up above her. And the flash behind her was had no diffuser on it, and the flash up above was on a big umbrella shooting up at the ceiling, so it really diffused the light almost like it was an overcast day. So that's what I was simulating in my studio when I took those pictures. But every part of the form that faces the light side has the potential to have more chromatic intensity in it than the parts of the form that start to turn away from the light. And I think that her hair is a very clear example of this. So back to what I was saying, look how the hair on the left-hand side, the skin on the left-hand side as it gets close to the hair, has more chromatic intensity or more saturation in it than the hair on the right-hand side that's turning away from the light, where the colors are getting a little more muted. The reflected specular on her hair is a little more gray, and the shadows there are less intense than the shadow on the left-hand side. The model for this painting, Katie, was also the model for my Ophelia painting, if you've seen that image or watched that video. And I have 2 more paintings of her that I've shot reference for that I'll have coming up. She's really wonderful to paint. She has a very beautiful kind of translucent skin, I love painting her. I think she's quite extraordinary, and she's a really neat and incredible person as well. And it's just been a pleasure to get to know her and to paint her. I've found that with so many of my models, when I paint them, I feel like I get to know them on a very superficial basis, you know, from staring at their face all day. But then often I'll be able to get to know them. They'll either come and model for me or my wife, and we'll get to know them better and develop a friendship, which is a real blessing. You know, that's a real gift, to be able to expand your circle of friends and get to know more people. So Katie is a very talented interior designer. And just like I said, I think she's quite extraordinary. Some of the other people that I've painted lately, Jazz Bynum, who I released a reference set for. If you're on Patreon, then you probably have that set. She's a professional ballet dancer and wonderful, and I am just wrapping up a painting of her as the Greek muse of dance. And I've heard it pronounced terpsichore and terpsichore, and I've looked up how to say it, and I've seen it listed both ways, so whatever your preference is. I think you probably have favorite things to paint. I know I do, and I love painting the transition of the lip into the flesh right around it. I love painting that dark line between the lips, and I love painting the facets of the nose. So painting someone that has a very strong or defined nose is always quite a treat. Oh, you can see on the eyelid there where I really hit it with some strong Terra Rosa and quinacridone magenta to really add. If you pause it, you can take a peek at that color or look at the final, that very intense red on the fold of the eyelid. I will use almost the exact same mixture, maybe a little bit deeper, a little bit darker, to define where the lips meet together. Maybe a little bit colder than above the eye, just because the lips tend to be a little cooler red than the skin around the eyelids, but that's such a satisfying thing to put in, those dark accents. The bridge of the nose that I was just working on, it's easy for that to get away from you. Remember, for most people, that's a faceted surface, meaning it doesn't just come to a peak, but it usually has a top-facing plane, and then it will have planes that angle away from that, and then you get the sides of the nose. And it helps to look for those, try and identify those as you're painting the bridge of the nose. Always look for the planes. Always look for the facets, whatever you're painting. They can be very subtle, especially on someone that has soft features, like Katie does. But those planes are there. And if you can identify them and identify those shapes, it will then help you identify when a plane changes directions. And anytime you have a change of direction, you're going to have a change of color. That color will represent a change in value, a change in chroma, and maybe even a change in hue. It has to, because it is changing how much light is hitting it. So it has to change. So if you can identify those planes, then you can paint the form. And if you can identify the shape of those planes, then you can get the likeness right. When you're painting things like highlights on the nose and on the lips, really get in there and look and see what color it is, because it's rarely going to be white. And depending on the color of the light that you've painted them on there, it can often be slightly warmer or cooler than the color that is underneath it. I find if I'm painting under a fairly cool light, often on the nose, it can look very pink or even pale blue. And on the lips, it can, if the lips are fairly kind of a warm rosy color, often the highlight can be cooler than the color of the lips underneath. Something that you probably have noticed on this are those kind of traditional color zones of the face. And on Katie's complexion, you can really see that stand out. Where the forehead zone tends to be a little bit more orange or yellow, and then the zone between the nose and the eyes tends to be a little more rosy red. And then when you get into the chin, the area around the mouth and the chin, it tends to lose a little bit of chroma, and so it tends to look a little more gray or even bluish or green, depending upon the colors that are around it. And if you push that too far on a woman, it can look like she has a little bit of a 5 o'clock shadow. And so you have to be careful, even though it can be very pronounced on some women, and no facial hair, just the skin tends to have a little bit less blood near the surface, and the skin's a little bit thicker there, and so it will become less chromatic than the skin right there over the nose, cheeks, and eyelids. But this I think would be a good example of that, of seeing those zones of the face from the cream, the rosy, and the cooler of the chin. I certainly have overdone it in the past. I don't think I have here, but I've certainly overdone it in the past. I have a few paintings hanging on my wall where I really pushed it and pushed it right over the edge. But that's how we learn, see how far you can take something. I think it's exciting to see those shifts in the face. I think it's very beautiful. And so I want to find where that line is so that I can exaggerate and push it further. I'm not necessarily only interested in painting what I can see in front of me. And you'll see that if you go back in the video or look in the files, you can compare the digital comp to my final painting and see there's differences there, even from what I had planned to what I ended up painting. Because as I work on it, there will be things that happen that I like, changes that'll be made, and I'll run with them. I'll keep those. Those are the artistic decisions that you'll make. More defining of that eyelid fold, which will help me anchor my values around the eyes, and kind of make sure that I get those deepest, most chromatic colors in, and then everything else can kind of cue from those. I was talking to a friend that I'm helping out with a painting, and we were talking about seeing values correctly. And a trick that you can do that can be helpful is to make a card that has a deep black and a pure white on it, as close as you can get to those. And you can place that on your painting, just tape it on there. And then on your reference, if it's digital, do the same thing. Make a swatch of black and a swatch of white and put it in the same place on your painting. And you can use that as kind of a touchstone to help gauge your values. On this painting, I had an interesting challenge in that I have a very, well, she's wearing a white blouse, but I have a very strong reflected light, or rim light, not reflected light, coming in from the right side. And I want it to feel very intense, like the sun is shining on her. But I have this white blouse in the front that needs to feel white without just being painted with pure white, because if I go too bright there, then I'm going to lose the intensity of that rim light. And it turns out that her blouse was really more of a pale kind of blue and pink in places. It never even got to white. And that saved me those values to paint for that rim light over on the right hand side. Rather than put a black and white swatch on there, I just looked for my darkest dark, which was right there, the pupil of the eyes and in the hair behind the right ear. And then for the brightest white, the brightest value, I should say, in the painting, and that was on that rim light. And I tried to gauge all of the other colors based upon those two values whenever I had a question. And then, of course, you get into a lot of local relationships when you're judging values, where you use the values directly around it to help you know what value to mix. Now, as I'm painting these clouds in, remember when I had the circle element in my comp, and then I had those diagonal lines creating, kind of a sweep from the upper right to the lower left? As I'm painting these cloud shapes, I've got that in mind of thinking, okay, what shapes can I create that will subtly enhance that overall gesture? And so you can see areas where I've created lines that sweep from the upper right to the lower left, and also even accentuate that circle around her head. You can see those cloud shapes up there. So I'm using them to help guide my decision making. It's nothing dramatic. It's nothing, super exaggerated or hitting you over the head with it, but it's enough that it's kind of creating synergy of thought, synergy of movement and dynamic in the painting. And I love doing that. I think that it's valuable. I think, like I said, it lends an organization and structure to my decisions in my compositions. So keep that in mind and see if that's beneficial to your own work. I see it a lot in Baroque painting, and I love that era of art. And so I've tried to adopt some of the picture making techniques that I've seen there. Particularly in Rubens. He was, of course, master of Baroque art, and also in artists like Pompeo Batoni, who kind of was at the end of that period. I think I'm finally starting to get the shape of that eye correct. The left eye. Get it to feel okay with the right eye next to it. See how seeing that the color of the sky is kind of that bluish gray green, I made the reflected light on the top of her head trend towards that color. Since if it's having a specular reflection on the hair up there, very fine, lots of tiny, shiny little strands of hair all reflecting a little bit of light, it creates almost kind of a diffuse reflection. But it's going to be reflecting the sky color around her. And so that's why those colors are what they are on the top of her head. Just as I'm making up, certain aspects of this painting, I'm just being aware of the environment that my subject is in, and that helps guide, those reflected lights. This ear was really fun to paint. I'm sure I've made this observation before, but I love the intense orange reds that you get shining through that skin and cartilage of the ear when there's a light behind it. And it can be the most intense flesh color that you get. It is light behind an ear, because it can be pure cad red light or even cad orange, depending upon the scene. There's not much else on the body that will do that. You know, I'm sure you've all taken a flashlight and shown it through your fingers, and you get that beautiful, intense red orange. And of course, you get the same thing in the ear when you get a bright light behind it. And it's just very satisfying to use color of that intensity. Ears are very complex shapes, very complex forms, I should say, and they're a lot of fun to paint. It just takes a little bit of patience to really observe and hit those forms, looking for the dark shapes, getting the values right, and then turning the form. I'll find myself in any painting wanting to wait until the very last to really put in the highlights or the effects or the rim lights, those sorts of things. One, because I enjoy it so much, but also because it's important to get everything else right before you put those final details in. So I'll wait until I'm finishing an area in order to put those in. Like on her forehead, I became confident. On those cheeks, I became confident that it'd have everything where I want it to be, color, value, shape-wise. And so I could finally go in and put in some of those highlights. That brush is a beautiful little synthetic mini rigger from Rosemary, and it's an excellent little detail brush. No, I take it back. That was a size 0 round eclipse. The mini rigger has a natural wood handle. So this is the 0 round eclipse from Rosemary. Look at that kind of gray green that I'm putting around her eyes. Decided to go in and exaggerate that a little bit. I had told myself that I was done rendering this area, but decided I wanted to put a little more color in and exaggerate that. You can decide when I'm done painting that if you think I made the right decision there or if it was better before. So back to mixing flesh. I had talked about some of the colors that I was using in this painting. But really, if you have a yellow and a red and a white and something to neutralize, you can mix beautiful flesh. And a yellow can be, a raw sienna, a cad yellow, a lemon yellow, and really anything probably like raw sienna or higher in value would work well. And then for the reds, you can have warm or cool reds. I've done paintings where I've used quinacridone violet or magenta as my red, and I've done it where I've used just a terra rosa as my red, or a burnt sienna, or a transparent red oxide, because you can warm the red up with the yellow, and you can cool the yellow down with the red, and then you can neutralize them both with whatever your gray is or your neutralizing color. And then, of course, you can lighten them with white, and usually the neutralizing color needs to be fairly dark, like an ivory black or a viridian or a raw umber, and you can make quite dark mixtures with that. So you can use a very limited palette and create some wonderful mixtures. So don't worry too much about exactly which colors you're using to mix flesh with, but consider, that you want a yellow and a red, and then of course white and a color to neutralize with, and you should be able to mix up some beautiful flesh with that. Painting these vines behind her head was interesting. Now I waited, at this point I had set the painting aside for a couple days and I let it dry before I started on these vines. And I don't always do that, but it just worked out in this case. I had another painting to get started that I wanted to jump in and do this. And as I'm painting these vines, I got away from my reference a little bit, which isn't really a problem, but I started doing something that I didn't like, and that I started making all these little undulations in the vines, kind of the back and forth, all even, and it became a little too patterned. And so it's something that I'm going to need to correct on it. But I talked about it before in my last painting, is that we tend to make patterns where patterns don't exist in nature. It might be when we're painting clouds or waves, we make all of the elements the same. All the little cloud shapes start to be the same size and shape, or we repeat that shape over and over. And I kind of did that in these vines. And so you can see I started to take out some of the shapes and straighten some areas out, take out some of those bumps and waves to give a little more of the natural irregularity that we find in nature. So be aware of that as you're painting anything, to not impose a pattern on it. Unless, of course, it's like a checkerboard floor, in which case you want it to be very accurate. I knew that I wanted this circular element behind her head to frame her within the picture. And I thought about doing it with kind of a swirl in the clouds to create that, but it didn't lend itself as much to the narrative of Brigid being kind of this goddess of the spring and of rejuvenation and new life. If you've seen some of my more recent paintings, you've seen me use like a decorative or architectural element, or the moon, to create a focus in a painting like that. But in this painting, I decided to go a little bit more surreal, or even symbolist, and have this wreath of vines, like it's growing in from without, beyond the borders of the painting, to create this circle where she just happens to be standing in front of it. And as a goddess might, be perfectly framed and augmented by nature, nature that she controls. And so it's one of those things that we can obviously get away with in art, where we don't have to rely on authenticity. We don't have to rely on exactly what might be realistic or happen. And we can say, no, this is what I want to do, and I'm doing this for a reason. And for me, this is creating that kind of circle of the seasons of the year, where we go from spring to summer, fall and winter, and then again and again, and that kind of eternal circle of life that happens. And I think the vine is beautiful for that, because a lot of vining plants will survive. They seem to die over the winter, but then they come back and they flower. And so I thought that that would be fitting to have as kind of her crown or wreath around her head, to symbolize that circle of life. And then the petals are starting to grow back on it, and simultaneously falling down around her. So maybe this is transitioning into fall, or maybe this is in the early days of spring. I guess whichever one you find more encouraging. In my mind, it is her right at the beginning of spring, where things are starting to blossom, but imposing those falling petals, I think, clouds that just a little bit, but in a good way. That swoop of hair that I put out there that's being blown by the wind, I put in there again to lend itself towards those diagonal lines. Same with the little tiny strand of hair on her forehead. It was one more thing. I could have put it on the other side, but I chose to put it on the left side and have it go from the upper right to the lower left, to be in concert with some of the other lines that I've made. Now, there's a lot of other shapes going on in this painting. You know, she's very vertical, and her necklace forms this crescent shape, and there's all kinds of folds and, you know, different shapes going on. So it's not as if there's this big exaggerated directional line running through the painting. But as I was explaining before, it is just a little sense of structure and direction that you can impose over a painting, that without it would maybe, in my mind, be a little less exciting or have a little bit less dynamic to it. Whereas adding in just a few small touches like that, it's like harmonious voices in a choir singing together, set against the backdrop of an orchestra that has a lot of different instruments and notes. And having that harmony set against the rest of the painting, to me, is very interesting, and it's compelling when it comes to a composition. It's a very useful tool to help give purpose to your decisions. When I went in and painted that rim light there, I did use some titanium white in that mixture, because I really wanted an opaque, intense highlight there. And I even built the paint up a little bit thicker. By the time it's all said and done, that'll probably be the thickest portion of paint on the painting, is that rim light, and the next thickest will probably be on her forehead and on her blouse, right there on the shoulder where it faces the light the most. I tend to use that as a guide. The most intense brightly lit areas tend to have the thickest paint, and the shadow areas usually have the thinnest paint. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it usually works out that way. I think it's descriptive and effective when painting form. You can observe that, of course, in like a Rembrandt painting, where he uses fairly pronounced impasto in the light areas, and then the shadows sometimes on Rembrandt's paintings are just the imprimatura still showing through, and you can see the texture and weave of the canvas. The paint is so thin in the shadows. I don't know why that's beautiful, but it really is. Norman Rockwell was a master at that too. I think that Rockwell is getting his due now, but for a long time Rockwell was not given credit for being so masterful with the paint. You know, you can set aside his subject matter and everything and just admire Rockwell for how well he used paint. And he's one of the greatest. I think that history will remember him for his depictions of an idealized form of life, but even more so for his skill as a painter, because he is an extraordinary talent, just really unbelievable. Now you can see as I'm going in with this second pass over the skin here on the neck and down onto the chest, how I'm making some subtle adjustments to those values. But I'm using a fairly thin paint here, and some of that first layer is able to show through and lend itself to the final paint, surface, that final appearance, and add some complexity and depth that would be hard to get in one pass. But that first pass was very quick. If you this video is all played back at the same rate, where I captured one frame every 15 frames. So it's about 2 frames a second is what I captured. It's all played back at the same rate, and you'll notice that that first pass, that ébauche or color lay-in, took a very small portion of the painting, but it's a very critical part of the painting process. If I get that right, then it makes my subsequent painting layers much easier to get right. Redoing the eyes a little bit, I wasn't happy with how those highlights went in, and so I knocked them back, and we'll get back to those. That transition from the light side to the dark on those eyes is a little bit harsh, so I'm giving them the attention that they need now. I find myself jumping around on my paintings a fair bit. Some of that's intentional and some of it's not. When it's intentional, I'll jump around so that I can continue working but have a fresh eye on what area I'm working on. I'm sure that you have things to paint that you find more difficult than others. I know I certainly do. And one of those areas, and I mentioned it before, that where the cheek transitions into the temple is always challenging, but also that where the cheek turns in from the light side into the dark side, those planes can often be very broad, And the transition in terms of value from the light side to the dark side can be very difficult to capture and maintain the accurate shape as you do that. So for me, that's a weakness. It's something that I find I always struggle a little bit with. And probably one of my solutions would be to use bigger brushes and attack those planes and shapes, break them down, simplify them. It's just, like I said, they can often be very subtle and hard to break down. So I wonder what what you find is a challenge. What might your weaknesses be? And I ask that because it's helpful to be aware of them so that you slow down a little bit when you hit those spots and you really say, okay, I know I struggle with this a little bit, so I really want to pay attention here and do this right. And, I'll maybe double, triple, quadruple check those areas to see if I'm on the right path with them. That down-facing plane on the nose that you saw me just put in, it's so satisfying to get that in correctly. So I've gone from one of my challenges, that cheek, turning into the temple, to something that I just love, which is like I said before, the facets on the nose, and you define that down-facing plane, and it feels like everything just comes into place on the nose. I love adding details like this, and you'll see in a lot of my paintings, I'll add little glows or petals or little motes of light, whatever it might be. But just going in and adding these tiny little, like baby's breath kind of flowers in her hair. I love that contrast of shape and value when you can juxtapose those together. The very soft hair and dark colors and the orange of the hair. And now I have these bright little crisp flowers in her hair that turn blue as they go into the shadow and form a nice contrast against the orange browns of the hair. That brush is one of the new red dot collection, a little round red dot. I think they actually arrived when I started this painting. I didn't have them, and then they arrived and I started using them, and they're wonderful little detail brushes. I highly recommend them. I don't make anything from Rosemary by recommending their brushes. I just think they're a terrific company and terrific people, and so I can wholeheartedly recommend their products. And that new red dot line is a synthetic red sable. I don't think I'll be buying red sable anymore. No need to kind of support a product that is inflicting harm on the animal. I've always kind of, I guess, dealt with that, but now that there's a choice, then I'm going to choose these synthetic ones because I think they are every bit as good. I haven't used them for watercolor, so I can't tell you if they work as well for watercolor as natural red sables do, but for oils, they're outstanding. I loved the color of the shadow that is being cast on her chest by the white shirt, because the material of that dress, of the blouse, is a little bit translucent, and so a little bit of light filters through it, but it also casts a shadow, and that light really bounces around in there, and it was a very beautiful, kind of intense peachy red color that's being bounced around in there. I think I used some Terra Rosa and some yellow ochre, and then I neutralized it just a little bit, and it's a beautiful color. I didn't let it get as intense. I could have really popped that color in there, but I didn't want it to get as intense or chromatic as the colors up around her face. I didn't want it to draw too much attention away. Something that I see one of my heroes do, Bugaro, is whenever he has a really bright value, he loves to create a high, highly chromatic haze around it when there's something darker behind it. So take that hair with the white fabric right in front of it, and I'm creating a little subtle haze that exaggerates the sense of light on that white surface. It doesn't have to be white in order for that effect to work or to look beautiful. But in this case, I'm taking the color of the hair and going up in value and up a little bit in chroma in order to create that haze. And it really, it's subtle. Like I said, it's subtle, but it creates a nice sense of light. You can see that as well, that I've started to hint at that on the right side where that really strong rim light is hitting the shoulder and starting to go up the neck of her, and the hair that's right behind it is kind of getting hazed out by this intense glow of light on her. So you might use that in your own works where you have very intense light hitting and you want to create an even stronger sense of that light on that form or surface. And you can add in that haze or glow around something, even if you've not seen it, even if it's not there in your reference. It's something you can do to exaggerate an effect. I think it's very beautiful. This kind of fabric is a lot of fun to paint because it is slightly translucent. So in those shadow areas, you'll pick up some of the color of the flesh that's underneath it. And so in the folds, I'm getting some pinks. And as you transition into the light, it will turn gray. And then when you get into the light side, it will take on more of the color of the light that's shining on it. And so it ends up, white is complex in the same way that flesh is, in that it reflects a lot of color. So as you're painting it, you really want to be aware of those temperature shifts and the color shifts as you move from the light into the dark. Very rewarding to paint surfaces like that. It's a great challenge, and I think one of the joys of being an artist is finding those challenges and jumping into them rather than shying away from them. I had a painting instructor once, a wonderful instructor. He had big impact on me. His name was Jim Garrison, and he taught at Mesa Community College in Arizona. And something that he's told me that's always stuck with me is if you want to look for someone's true complexion, it will often be on their chest or torso where they get very little sun. And that's where you can really see what their complexion looks like. So maybe on their ribs or on the back or right across their chest, depending upon where they might live or how they might dress. But you can get a feel for what the complexion is without a tan, without that color from the sun affecting it. I've found that regardless of their ethnicity, whether they're wherever the model may come from, that underneath the arms, or often right on the neck underneath the chin, or on the chest or torso, male or female, often has just some very beautiful, delicate, um, subtle tones in their skin where it can get a little bit more translucent. You can see often some vascular structure underneath the surface of the skin, and it's quite extraordinary and beautiful. I think that there's a great beauty to the human form that deserves respect, but also deserves admiration. Um, we saw that begin in the a Renaissance, or I guess, the Renaissance was the rebirth of those ideals from our Greek heritage. But that that respect and honoring of the human form, where today I think that we've over-sexualized the human body, and it obscures our ability to um, respectfully observe and appreciate the human form. Um, as artists, I think that through the training that we receive, that sometimes we might have a little more insight or reverence as to how remarkable the body is than maybe people who haven't done that. I'm guessing that truth exists for medical professionals and doctors, and people in a lot of different fields that um, I'm not aware of because I haven't walked in those shoes. But I know so many artists that look at the body reverentially and with great respect for how incredible it is. And I think that's a wonderful, beautiful thing. I have a painting coming up of Icarus, and the model for my painting is qualified for the Olympic trials in the breaststroke. And I think he was 6'4", 6'5", and just had an incredible body from his training, and unusual proportions, wonderful for a swimmer. And he looked like he could fly. Just his shoulders were so broad, and his lats were really incredible. So I'm excited to do that painting. Hopefully I can pull it all together the way I want to. It's a tricky composition, and tricky to get the reference just right. So we'll see what happens. But I don't paint as many men as women. My paintings of women tend to sell better than my paintings of men, but I do want to do a series from Greek myth of a lot of the male Greek heroes and male Greek figures, and then I'll branch out into some other mythologies as well. So wish me luck with those. I'm excited to get to them. I still have quite a few in this series of the goddesses of various mythologies that I'm working on, but I'll be heading towards those soon too. On that right side, as I'm wanting that rim light to look intense, one of the ways that I can also help with that is I can make the values right next to it darker, provide a little more contrast on that area, and then it will make the rim light feel even brighter. So as I work my way across the form of those sleeves and shoulder, I'm pushing the values a little bit darker. That way I can make the rim light punch just a little bit more. I'm excited to get into the gold of that corset. I touched it just a little bit. When painting reflective surfaces like that gold corset or the necklace, it's important, very, very important, to look for the shapes and not get too caught up in all of the little details of the reflections. And if you can get those big light and dark shapes in, so much of the work of creating that effect of being metallic or being reflective is accomplished and done very quickly. The overall palette for this painting is fairly restricted. It really is kind of a yellow and blue painting. It's a blue-green, and then the yellow sky, and then her flesh is a yellow-orange with bits of red in there. But it's really a two-color painting, not quite complementary, but very close to being complementary colors in this. You know, you have that narrow range of yellow, red, and orange set against the kind of teal, blue, green of both the sky. Oh, so this is an interesting point. This goes by very quick in the painting, but I let it completely dry. I'm down in Arizona and I set it out in the sun. And now I'm doing a glaze over the entire painting of raw umber. And it's doing a couple things. One, it's warming up and unifying some of the colors throughout the whole piece. But it is also adding interest to the surface of the painting, where I have a little bit thicker paint. It is pushing down into the crevices of it and bringing out a little sense of relief. You're not going to be able to see that on the painting unless you really see it in person. But it creates kind of a patina over the whole piece that I think is really beautiful. And now I'm going back into that and I'm painting opaquely into it to bring out the forms of those vines and give a little bit more contrast. You know, when I glazed over it, it knocked all the values down just a little bit. And so I want to bring those back out. I find whenever I glaze an area that I like to paint opaquely on top of that in at least a few places, and it gives some solidity to those forms. Whereas a glaze can make everything feel kind of transparent and a little bit filmy. It's a beautiful effect, but I don't want that everywhere. So now I'm painting back into it. And it also is a way to fairly quickly bring out a little more contrast in whatever you're painting, because you can knock it all down. And then it's fairly easy to go in and reinforce some of those light side shapes and highlights and punch them back out. But the raw umber that I was using is from Vasari. And I mention that because Vasari's raw umber is particularly oily, whereas some brands are fairly pasty. The raw umber from Vasari straight out of the tube is wonderful for glazing. You can take any other brand that you like if you have a favorite brand and use it. But if it's a little bit thick, I would recommend adding some linseed oil before you do something like this. Or even better is a product called Oleo Gel from Natural Pigments that is basically clear oil paint. It is linseed oil with fulminated silica or tiny little glass beads in it. And so it works just like oil paint. You don't have to worry about introducing too much oil or a different medium or anything, because it's just paint. It just happens to be clear. And it's wonderful for doing glazes like that. But give it a try in your painting. You know, you can go at it fairly timid to start with and sneak up on the effect that you're getting. That way you're not going to wreck anything. Worst case, you can take a lint-free cloth and wipe it back down with some Gamsol and get that back off of there. Just make sure that your painting is completely dry. Let it dry for however long in your climate it needs to make sure that nothing's going to come back up. Here in Arizona, oil paint dries incredibly fast. It's so dry, and even in the winter, it can be warm enough that I'll set these in a window, and by the next day, it's usually pretty darn dry. I think I gave this 2 or 3 days to make sure, but I just worked on some other paintings while I was letting this one totally dry, and then did that glaze. It's so fun to do. It's very satisfying. So I recommend giving it a shot if you haven't done that. It lends some gravity to your painting. At this point, I'm really looking forward to painting that gold corset, but I'm saving it because it's kind of like dessert. That it's so fun to paint things like that, so I'm holding off on it. I'm using a really tiny red dot from Rosemary right now that just has a beautiful point on it to paint those little filaments of hair. I think for me, this is, next to designing the piece, this is the most fun part of the painting, where you get to put in all of those little highlights and reflections and paint things like the jewelry and, you know, the little petals coming up here and the rim light, all those tiny little touches that bring magic to the piece. Everything else leading up to it is work, getting it all put down, letting it dry, that sort of stuff. But this really gets my adrenaline going. A challenge for you as you are considering your next painting to do. If you haven't done a master copy, that's always a good exercise. But after you do a master copy, it's important to know, how do I apply what I learned from that master copy to my own work, where I'm not copying someone, where I'm doing my own thing. And what you can do is take an old master painting and create your own version of it. Hire your model, get your costume, do your lighting, create your own unique composition. But you know, do something that is very much an homage to someone that you admire. One of my recent paintings, my last video that I posted, I know not why it falls on me, is I did that exercise relating with Godward and Tatama. So here, finally get to the corset to paint it. I'm using a titanium white with some Naples yellow here, and some radiant yellow and some Indian yellow, to get a few different kinds of yellow in there to capture all those different intensities. And then I wanted to use the titanium white to have that very opaque white for these highlights and make it quite quick to capture that effect. And I'm not going to overly detail it. I want to give that impression, but not necessarily dip into the photo real or hyper real and paint all the little threads and texture on that corset. When you see the light shift like that in the painting, that's when I've gone from night to the next day. And the morning light is very different from the light in the evening. And then, of course, once the sun goes down, then the light changes quite a bit, because I don't have that north window light coming in. So that's why you'll see that shift in the video a few times. That means that I've got a good night's rest and I'm hitting it again the next day. I find that some of the details that are often the most important to get right are where two different forms meet, or two different materials and surfaces meet. So it might be the hairline, you know, where the hair meets the scalp. That's very important. Where this blouse is meeting that underbust corset. And because it seems to be very important to define the forms and also the materials that things are made of. So it's a place where you get a chance to define the edge as being hard or soft. You get a lot of reflected light bouncing in there. Often it's where you get some of your darker colors too, if there's not reflected light. And those are critical towards the likeness in the form. So pay attention to those transitions, the transition from one material or one form to the other. This was a fun little challenge here. The robe that she was wearing has some sheer passages with some velvet patterning over the top of it. And so I wanted to capture the white of the sleeve and also the skin of her arm through that teal robe. It always is a little bit of a mental challenge, but in practice, it's not very difficult to do that. And so if you like that effect, I recommend, find some sheer fabric and drape it over your model and go for it, because again, it's one of those things that, like reflective surfaces, is very satisfying to paint and is probably not as difficult as it might seem if you haven't done it before. It's easy to overdo rim lights. You want to make sure that you don't rim light everything. If I were to extend this rim light around the whole form, it would flatten out the form. You want to um, limit it to one side of a form primarily. And again, this rule can be broken. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's important to understand what happens when you break it. Um, and then I will usually let that rim light fall off on that side as well, so that it kind of spotlights a little bit and isn't everywhere. You don't want um, every element to be the star of the show, so to speak. You want some lead actors and you want some supporting actors. And when you put the rim light in, you want to keep it so that it can stand out as one of the lead actors and not go crazy and put it everywhere and dilute its effect. Again, with these petals, I'm maintaining the simple palette. I could have made the petals green or blue or violet, or introduced a new color into the painting, but I kept them a pink, very much within the range of her flesh colors, so that I could just kind of have automatic harmony in this painting. If I keep it within the palette of the rest of the piece, then I have that harmony. I think they stand out enough without needing to introduce a new color. So they can sing with the same voice, so to speak, rather than introduce a new voice. If I wanted to bring more attention to them, I could have done them a different color from the rest of the piece. I could have made them like a cool blue or a violet, and they would have really popped a lot more, but I think they're going to get enough attention as they are. I have to be careful here not to let them turn into a pattern, either, as I was mentioning before, in the vines, how I said in clouds, how it's our natural tendency to do that, to create patterns. And so as I space these petals out, I want to make sure that they have a good irregular organic spacing. You can see there's several around her head right now that are spaced a little bit, maybe a little too even for nature. Um, but as I go in and I place more of the petals on those vines, it will appear to break that up a little bit more. I think the only thing in painting these petals that I really needed to watch out for, other than the spacing of them and placement, was making sure that they also reflected the lighting in the scene. And that meant that as they descended down into that lower left-hand corner, that they got darker and reflected the colors that are around them. I even add some in that are that dark teal green in the lower right-hand corner, doing that to push them into the background. But that was really the only other consideration that I had in painting them after the placement and color, was making sure that they looked like they belonged in that same lighting space as the rest of them. Now, I made those ones in the right-hand corner that same teal green color because I didn't want them to distract from that line, the petals, that diagonal line that those petals are making across her body. At least not distract as much as they would have. Imagine if those in the lower right-hand corner were bright pink or bright red, they would have drawn the eye quite a bit more. But as they are, down there, they just kind of add a little more shape and a smaller little point of contrast down there. Still read as petals, but don't steal the show as much. So you might think, well, how are they teal green petals instead of the pink petals? But my thought is that it doesn't matter. I think it works from a composition standpoint. And so we'll let the explanation as to why or what those are coming from go unanswered, and just let them exist as a good design element. And that's okay to do because you're the artist. You can make that decision. Now I'm adding in a few little blossoms directly on the vines rather than just the petals floating around. So these add with the narrative of the piece, this blossoming vine in spring, to help reflect the myth of Brigid. I think as I do more paintings and as I get more experienced, I become more and more content with just not adding quite as much detail or refinement to every aspect of my painting. But there are other aspects where I really want to add more refinement. That's often in the way I'm painting the flesh, the variety of the colors, and temperature shifts in the flesh are wonderfully rewarding and intriguing to me. But it's also very satisfying to see how simply I can try and express something, like the sleeve showing through the sheer fabric of the robe, where you can go in and kind of count those brush strokes, that it's very simple. And you saw me paint it. I didn't spend very much time on it, noodling or refining. And I think as long as it conveys the idea and doesn't look out of place within the painting, that's enough. It doesn't need to go further. And then the areas where I do take it further are often for my own satisfaction, my own delight in painting. Keep an eye on my Instagram or Twitter for this one once it goes into its frame, because I have an absolutely stunning frame for it from Masterworks. I bought the frame first and then thought I'd plan a painting later to go into this size of in format of frame, and I love it. I think it's going to look just gorgeous in it. The gold of it is very similar to the gold of the corset that she's wearing. Note the variety of sizes of subjects in the painting, from the tiny little flowers on her head to the blossoms on the vine and the petals floating down around her, the big shape of the corset, the blouse, the robe. All of those things add variety to it. Consider that whether you're painting a landscape or a still life. Introduce that variety of shape size. You know, I think it's important to consider in your pieces, do I have a strong light shape and a strong dark shape? Do I have a good palette with some variety in it, or am I going for a monochromatic palette? Do I have a variety of shapes? Do I have a variety of edges? Consider all of the different tools that you have to create interest and intrigue in your painting, and are you using all of those tools? Even if you're painting something very simple, I think the richness of it grows quite a bit as we incorporate that variety. So I didn't want the little blossoms on her head to be the same size as the blossoms that are on the vine. I think it's more interesting when they have that variety. Now the last, pushing those last highlights on the flesh, establishing that beautiful plane on the forehead, that reflected, or that strong plane of light on the breast and on the corset, just kind of reinforcing some of those shapes. Those last little touches add a lot. You'll notice that when I'm holding the maul stick, even with these details in that long brush, I can be fairly far back from the canvas. I don't have to hold the brushes right up against the ferrule. And I find that I have better vision of my piece and plenty of control when I do that. We're just about to the end. Thanks for watching the video. I hope that it was useful and that you learned some valuable things to apply to your own work. And here is a shot of the final capture of the painting. Thank you again, and go do a master study and then do your own version of it, and then graduate from there to find your own inspiration in nature, wherever that might come from, and start creating your own masterpieces. Thanks again for watching.